Thank you so much. Excuse me, good evening. And thank you very much, and thank you for coming out. I didn't expect this many people, frankly, on such a beautiful night, and I know what a wonderful gift it is to give to anybody an hour or hour and a half of your time, and I'm very grateful for it, and I'll try to make the most of it. I am going to talk about Lincoln first. I heard Susan's description of my book. I must tell you, it was so flowery and so positive that I had to remind myself I actually wrote it. And it's nice to hear that about the book because it was a very important effort for me. I had done a book on Lincoln some years ago with Harold Holzer, who was a true Lincoln scholar and a fellow I had worked with for years and has been a good friend of mine for 20 or 30 years now. And the book was a kind of collection of Lincoln essays on the subject of democracy that we put together for two teachers from Solidarity in Poland who came to the governor's office in Albany and asked me to come to Poland to lecture to them on democracy because the Soviets had finally been driven from Poland and they had restored or were restoring the democratic way of life. And they said that they needed some help in being reminded of what democracy really meant. And I said, well, I'm not the person for you. Let me get a book by not Jefferson, whom everybody thinks of automatically as the Democrat, but Lincoln, who was called a Republican. And I'll have it translated into Polish, and we'll raise money and get you a few thousand copies, which eventually we did, and send them over. And he said, oh, that was wonderful. And I went home and looked in the collected works of Lincoln by Bassler, a copy of which had been given to me. It's a series of 9 by my sister in 1955 as a gift. I looked in the index, and under the word democracy, nothing appeared. And I was shocked, and eventually we called together Lincoln scholars from around the United States, and I said to them, this is outrageous, So what we did was break up Lincoln's life into 7 periods and select one historian like McPherson or Barrett or any of these great Lincoln people to that period. I said, cull from Lincoln's speeches and writings the best things you have on democracy. We'll do it in 7 sections, have his whole life. We put together a collection that won some prizes. And ever after that, the publishers asked me to do another book on Lincoln. I said, well, I'm not an historian. I'm not going to do Lincoln's love life, Lincoln's feet, Lincoln's speeches. Lincoln. I said, they're already doing that. He's by far the most popular president in American history. By far, no one's even close. Everybody uses him. Every Democrat, every Republican says he's with Lincoln. I said, not unless it's relevant, and not unless I can contribute something that I feel comfortable with, will I do another Lincoln book. And nothing happened until 9/11. And then nothing happened until the first memorial of 9/11. And just before the first memorial of 9/11, a reporter called me and said, we're about to have the memorial of 9/11, and the governor will speak, and Mayor Bloomberg will speak, and former Mayor Rudy Giuliani will speak. And if you were still the governor and you had to speak, what would you say? And I said, oh boy, what a daunting prospect that is. I said, I'm glad, in a way, I'm not the governor because it's so difficult. This, perhaps the most impactful episode in our lifetime, and maybe one of the most impactful in modern history of the United States, at least. What will they say? And if you remember, the memorial came, and then it was over, and none of them spoke. They recited the names of the deceased, and then read from Lincoln. And I said, whoa, what does this say about Lincoln? Well, it says something I've always believed, and that Lincoln is more than just a revered relic. Lincoln is relevant. The reason for all that popularity goes far beyond the fact that he was raised from a log cabin to the presidency of the United States. He was educated only for a year formally, but wrote like a poet and spoke like Demosthenes. It was more than he kept the Union together in the Civil War. over the odds, that he rose up from terrible unpopularity to be one of the most popular presidents in American history, that he began the process of ending slavery in the United States of America. There was something more than that. Well, his martyrdom had a lot to do with it, as it did with John Kennedy. In all candor, we have a special place in our heart for people who were striving and who were noble appearing and noble acting for the most part, and who then give up their life for us as martyrs, and that had something to do with his popularity. But for me, it was more than that from the very beginning. From the first time I read Lincoln, I was impressed by his intelligence. I was impressed by, yes, of course, his magnificent eloquence, but it was much more than that. As I grew older and continued to read him and became a lawyer myself, I was just dazzled by his mind. This was an extremely intelligent human being, a broadly, deeply visionary, philosophical human being, and of course, a magnificently eloquent one. And so I said, if he's relevant, and if he's all these things, why don't we use him more than just at a memorial? Why don't we ask him about preemptive war? Why don't we ask him about taxation? Those are both subjects he knew very well. Preemptive war he addressed specifically when his partner Herndon said, "How do you feel about preemptive war?" And he answered. And the answer is as relevant today and as pointed, as startlingly relevant, as a matter of fact. Taxation, he invented the income tax. Progressive, it was unconstitutional when he did it, but he did a number of unconstitutional things when he really needed to. Well, now people will say, when you say, let's listen to him on religion, let's listen to him on the role of government, let's listen to him on race, of course, he talked about slavery, but what about multilateralism? Yes, he's good on multilateralism too. And people say, no, hold it a second. You know, how dare you tear him out of context? 1865, this is 2004, this is internet, globalization, true multilateralism, the shrinking of the globe. Look at all that's happened between then and now. How dare you tell us what Lincoln would say today and suggest is relevant? Oh, really? You use them at the memorial. You read the Founding Fathers every day in the courts of this nation to tell you how to read the Constitution and how to apply it today. Have you stopped reading the Old Testament? Or Plato or Aristotle? Or all those ages of wise people and wise things that they uttered? Of course you make adjustments. Of course you have to take into consideration the difference in time and place. Of course. But the essential wisdom doesn't change. So I brushed off that silly, I think, suggestion. Now, well, then why don't more scholars do that? The real scholars, you say you're yourself not a scholar. Well, I've read Lincoln since 1955, as I say, and I'm familiar generally with Lincoln, but I haven't studied him the way the historians do. Well, why won't they apply him the way you have? Or maybe they will when they read my book, and maybe they'll say, you're wrong, fine. It's very much how I feel about Fahrenheit 9/11. You know, well, what do you think of Moore? What do you think of this? I'll tell you what I think of the whole thing. It's a documentary. It's pictures. It's real pictures. And he draws conclusions from it. And what I would love to see more than anything else is not that you say, well, every part of it is right, every implication is correct, every insinuation well-founded. No. What I want you to say is, it's evidence, thank God, instead of 28-second commercials. And so what you should do is dispute it with evidence. If you think it's wrong, if you think Bandar did not sit down 2 days after 9/11 with the president for 3 hours in the White House, inexplicably talking about something that has never been reported, if you can say that's not so, say so. But let's argue the facts and the evidence and all of that. Wouldn't it make for a much better campaign than we're going to have with $200 million worth of 28-second commercials? What can you say in 28 seconds about abortion? What can you say in 28 seconds about what you do about terrorism after you mount the largest military campaign in your history? What can you say in 28 seconds about preemptive war and what it really means and why it's good or why it's bad? Very little. But you can say it in a documentary, and you can say it in arguments that call for proof and evidence, and so too with Lincoln. I think, if you listen to Lincoln, you read this little book, and it's a little book like Lincoln's little book, Weems. He loved the Weems book. He called it My Little Book. It was a little book that had an awful lot of ideas in it and history, and it was rich with advice. And so I hope you'll get a chance to read this book. The name of the book is Why Lincoln Matters Today More Than Ever, and there's a wonderful, wonderful picture of it, and you can see how small it is. It won't take you long. And I'd suggest that you read the introduction first, and then you skip all the way to page 166. And we'll come back later, but go to 166, because on 166, I have what is more than a conceit. It is Abraham Lincoln, imagine him as president today, talking to the Congress in a State of the Union address, but talking about all of today's problems, talking about what's happened to us with our friends overseas, talking about the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan before that, the lack of planning, terrorism, what needs to be done with terrorism, the domestic scene, what you think of the tax cuts, what you think of the condition of the people of the United States of America. And all of that is in about 2,600 words in a State of the Union message. And then come back, and you'll find in the beginning of the book there's a delightful 15 or 20 pages that Harold Holzer and I did together about how all the presidents have used Lincoln. And my favorite, may rest in peace, because I loved him, I really did, President Reagan. I got to know him. I was governor while he was president. He did the National Economic Commission in his last year at my suggestion. I was chairman of the National Governors Association at that point, in charge, not chairman, chairman of the Budget Committee. And if you think all the way back to then, we had this intractable deficit that nobody could handle, and I had a plan for how to handle it, and he adopted it. President Bush undid it a year later, the National Economic Commission, and it hurt him. Bob Woodward said if he hadn't undone it, he wouldn't have been forced to give that tax increase after he had promised not to, and he might have been president for a second term. But anyway, I knew him well, and I liked him, and told a favorite joke about having met him. I told it here once about being introduced to President Reagan, and I told the story with President Reagan sitting next to Matilda at a gridiron dinner, my wife Matilda, and I remember standing up and saying, "This isn't the first time I've met the president. I was introduced to him once, or it was an attempted introduction." And the introducer said, "Mr. President, I want you to meet." And before he could get my name out of his mouth, President Reagan cocked his head the way he would and said, "Oh, you don't have to introduce us. I know Lee Iacocca well." And for one terrible moment, I almost said what a kid from Queens would say to a crack like that. And I didn't. It got to the tip of my tongue, and prudence bit it and spat it out. I was going to say, "I know, Mr. President, to some people we all look alike." But I never said it. And so he was a wonderful man. Whatever you say about his record, and there's a lot we could say about his record, and there's a lot I did when I was governor, because we were at different ends of the situation. He was cutting the income tax, and everybody else had to raise the regressive taxes, because in order to pay for the income tax cuts, they had to cut the budgets for the states and the cities, and so the city was in trouble, and et cetera, et cetera. There's all of that. But he was a great man. He was a great human being. And the character lessons he taught you, just by never showing any anger, never showing any vindictiveness, getting shot and waving out the window at everybody, making jokes. He was a marvelous person. But with Lincoln, he, at the 1992 convention of the Republicans, read this series of epigrams from Lincoln. They were wonderful, and they sounded like an absolute response to everything Clinton was talking about doing as president. Until after it was over, somebody looked at these Lincoln epigrams and said they were written by some Protestant minister, and Lincoln never had anything to do with them. And the power of Reagan as an individual was such that everybody ignored the fact. They kept quoting them as Lincoln epigrams, and maybe still do. And so Lincoln has always been gloriously, gloriously relevant and can be much more useful today than he has been up until now. Now again, there are all sorts of specific applications, global independence, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that moves me most about him is his vision and the grandness of his vision. And sometimes in political life, and I'm sure you feel the same way, but when you're steeped in it, and as I was, and still am to a large extent, for a long time, and you're studying it all the time, and you're even in a position to do something about it for 12 years, governor, 12 years, and you're involved in presidential campaigns, and you're debating, and you're fighting, and you think, gee willikers, can't we do better than this? I mean, isn't there something more we can do about this country? We're so great, we're so powerful, even without trying. We're the world's greatest engine of opportunity ever. Mama and Papa would never have made it anywhere else the way they made it here. They couldn't read or write. They had no skills. They had no money. They had no friends. They came here. They raised a family, had kids. One of them became a governor. The other two were much better. And look at how wonderful. Look at all the money we have. Nobody has the wealth and power we have. Nobody. Everybody wants to come here, almost. Very few people want to leave, except occasionally they want to leave so they don't have to pay taxes. They don't want to leave the residence. They don't want to leave the protection. But they'll incorporate in Bermuda so they can beat you on the taxes. But apart from that departure, very few people want to leave here. And so you say to yourself, when you see all that power and all that strength and all the good fortune God has given us and all the resources we have and how everybody quakes at the idea of taking us on one-on-one, you say, well, then why? Why do we have the problems we have? Why do we have all these poor people? Why don't the schools work? Why do we have 42, 43 million people without health care? Why is it that a woman 28 years old, 30 years old with breast cancer, without insurance, who works as a secretary but whose boss doesn't give her a policy, which increasingly is the case for people who work, and who isn't poor enough for Medicaid, not old enough for Medicare, has cancer, needs a mastectomy, and then she's bankrupted for life, or at least for a long time. And if she happens to be a little bit older and have a couple of kids, then what does she do? She's a single spouse. And how does that happen in this country? So you get aggravated and you say, we must be capable of something more than this. And so you look at this campaign as an opportunity and say, okay, we're about to pick another president or restore the former president, but it's big. Now we have to deal with war and deal with terrorism and deal with an economy that's a problem and a sagging middle class. Okay, here are all the opportunities. Maybe now they'll come forward with something big, some philosophy, some big idea, some coalescing notion. Maybe they'll have a plan for us to say, this is what we really are as a people. And bring us, so let's see what happens. And what has happened in the campaign so far? So far, it's all President Bush. Why? Well, because it's terrorism and it's war, and that's what a president does. And that's where we're concentrating, and we're losing. We lost more Marines today. And it'll be 1,000 that were killed soon, and maybe 12,000 who have come home mutilated. You can't tell because they don't really give you the numbers. And maybe 20,000 innocent Iraqis that have been killed. And we can't tell that either because they don't give you those numbers either. But all of this is happening. Okay, Mr. President, so what is your plan? What is your big idea? What is your philosophy? I'm confused. What do we do? Well, so far, we're going to be the strongest. We've got a powerful military. We're going to beat Saddam Hussein, and we got Saddam Hussein, and he's going to get executed, and we're still facing Osama, and we got military might, and we won't give up until we've finished, and we're going to create a democracy in Iraq. All right, then what? And that's the end of terrorism? You're going to kill the terrorists, and does that end them? And the answer is no, of course not. We know that. Ask Sharon. Ask anybody in Israel. I mean, you can't end it by just killing the terrorists because it produces other terrorists. That's how difficult it is. It's a cancer. And a terrorist is a malignant growth, and so you have to extirpate it. But it It's not enough to pull out the growth because the cancer's still there. And in this case, the extirpating of one produces others automatically. So you've got to do something about getting to the disease. Oh, we don't want to talk about that. That's mushy liberalism. Next thing you'll hear is root causes. My God. Oh, no, let's not talk about root causes. Why should we talk about root causes? Just because that's the only intelligent thing to talk about after you've tried force, and no, force alone is not enough. And so we're not getting it from the Bush people, and we haven't gotten it from the Democrats yet. Why? Because he hasn't had his chance yet, Kerry. Why? Because you're not looking at him yet. Soon you will, soon you'll have to, because before people in this country will vote, they're going to make sure Kerry comes out and say, okay, let's see what you have now. They're not going to say, we looked at Bush and he's not adequate. That won't happen. No matter how less than fully adequate he may be, people, no, whatever your judgment, people will say, you've got to show me something better. And if you don't, he will be president, no matter what the polls say now. And so we haven't seen that big idea, that big philosophical vision. That's what Lincoln had. And that's what appeals to me most. His words and acts expressed the two great principles we live by, or should live by, as taught by all the great religions. You know, I had an opportunity, I never said it myself, but I had an opportunity to, be considered for the Supreme Court of the United States. Actually, it happened twice. But And I didn't say it, but it came out. It was in a book by Stephanopoulos, and then President Clinton talked about it. And every once in a while, people would say, "Gee, Willikers, why? You love the law, and they say you're pretty good at it. And why didn't you go to the Supreme Court?" And it's very hard to explain. It's very hard to explain to Matilda, let alone to everybody else. And I'm not sure I can really try, but maybe this is useful or maybe that experience is useful in thinking about Lincoln. Lincoln looked at the Constitution, and Lincoln was a lawyer, and he loved the Constitution. And he knew that it was this great document, this first of our 10 civic commandments, the fundamental law of the nation, that makes us free, the Bill of Rights. Thank God for that, the freedom to speak, to love, to believe. It gives us liberty. That's magnificent, wonderful, and we have to protect it at all costs. But that's basically all it gives us, is freedom. Wonderful. But that's all. It doesn't say anything about loving one another. It doesn't say anything about equality. It doesn't say anything about fairness. It doesn't say anything about, hey, listen, if old people are dying because they're sick and they have no wealth to buy medical attention, you should come together and take care of them. It doesn't say that. You didn't get Medicare and Medicaid until 1965. You passed the Constitution in 1789. The Constitution was missing something. It called for slavery and for unfair treatment to women and many others in this society. But liberty, yes. Lincoln cherished the liberty, obviously, and used that part of the Constitution, but he wanted something more. He had a greater vision, so he turned and he looked at the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is at a higher level of morality, because it's the Declaration of Independence that says to you, look, there's a force up there beyond all of us. And you can call it God or the Creator or the Omnipotent, whatever. And we want to be careful about that because we want to not get into trouble with religions. But there's a force up there, an intelligence up there, larger than any of us, that gives us basic rights. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And people are entitled to equal opportunity and equal dignity. And Lincoln looked at that and says, I'm going to take that Declaration of Independence and I'm going to squeeze it together with the Constitution and make one grand new commitment. A Constitution that absolutely keeps all that liberty that is given you and never relinquishes it, but at the same time adds the sweetness of the Declaration of Independence, the love, the compassion that's implicit in it. He believed in two ideas. And he talked about it everywhere. It's all through his work, all through his action. When he talks about the economy, when he talks about the rest of the world, when he talks about people in China. And, he only once stepped out of the United States, and that was to see Niagara Falls in Canada. And in New York, we don't consider that another country or a foreign policy. That's upstate New York, Canada, at least beyond the falls. But despite that, he talked about it always. Two principles. It's going to be familiar to a lot of you in this audience, but these are his two principles. Number one, equality of opportunity, not equality of result. Nobody ever promised Mama and Papa, don't worry, you're going to do just as well as those people who were here 3 generations ago. But they did promise Mama and Papa, don't worry, you'll get a shot. You'll be treated fairly in terms of having the opportunity to succeed. He believed, look, you're supposed to love one another as individuals. And what are we supposed to do with that relationship? That sense of, well, we're all equal and therefore all equally entitled to dignity. And as a practical matter, we're all interconnected and interdependent. Words you didn't hear again until Václav Havel and Gorbachev. Well, what do we do with that? He said, well, what you do with it is you come together and you make the society better. And you work to make this country stronger. All of you together. The labor with the owners of the capital. Capital is important, but you'd be nowhere if it weren't for labor. That's Lincoln. And so treat those working people right. Let them be more efficient because they're paid better, et cetera, et cetera. So love one another and work together to improve the society. Does that sound familiar? Isn't that Tzedakah and Tikkun Olam? And isn't that the beginning of monotheism? And didn't the Christians say exactly the same thing? Lincoln wasn't religious. Lincoln wasn't religious. Lincoln was not religious, formally religious. Lincoln said God frequently, quoted the Bible always. But when asked, are you a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, Buddhist, Mohammed, is he your God or your disciple or your apostle or whatever, your leader religiously? He said, no. None of them. He said, well, why don't you belong to a specific religion? He said, because they all have rules and regulations, admonitions and prohibitions that require you to suspend your intellect and to accept them without being able to prove it intellectually. Well, of course, that's why they call it faith. If it weren't for that, you'd call it knowledge. It's faith. You've got to believe it because you choose to believe it at one point. It's something not compelled by your intellect, but not rejected by your intellect either. And that's more or less conforms with the evidence you see. It's not rejected by the evidence, but it's not compelled by the evidence. So I choose to believe it. I choose to believe there's this great infinite power. Well, can you describe it? No, it's infinite, and I'm here. I got a little shrunken mentality, 98% monkey. I mean, what? So those are the two Lincoln principles, and that's what we're missing in this world, and it has all kinds of consequences. He would say this, for example. He would say, look, what would you do with the war? Forget about preemptive war. He told Herndon, you can't have a preemptive war. Why? Because if you let the president decide when to go to war without going to the Congress, it's the Congress who has the right to declare war. If you say to the president, if you think Canada is going to invade, you can invade Canada first. If that's what you do, maybe the president will be wrong. And you didn't have a chance to stop him because he decided on doing it. Maybe he'll be cynical. Maybe he has another idea. Maybe he's going to start a phony war. We've done that in our history, as you know. Maybe he's going to start a phony war. You've gone around the Constitution. You're supposed to go to the Congress. That's why they gave the Congress the right to declare war. So don't do preemptive war. So he wouldn't have started the preemptive war in Iraq. How about Afghanistan? Would he have gone to war in Afghanistan? Absolutely. Why? Because he went to war, didn't he? To keep the Union together with a fury. He went to war. He was he was tougher commander than most of his generals. And he demanded more. And he was a nut on weapons of mass destruction, given the limitations of weapons of mass destruction at his time. I mean, he worked on new battleships, new guns, new everything. So he was a fierce fighter, but he never would have started the second war against Iraq. That was a preemptive war. And he wouldn't have started a second war before he finished the war in Afghanistan because he was against two wars. And he would have realized, because he's smart enough to realize that you can't win the war against terrorism, for the reason I've just given you before, the cancer analogy, with just force. Yes, you need force. Yes, you must catch the bad guys. Yes, you must get Osama. Yes, it was good to take down Saddam Hussein. But that's not going to stop the terrorism. You have to stop the propaganda of the madrasas. You have to do something to relieve whatever it is that's making them hate us. And that doesn't mean weakness, that means strength and intelligence. And incidentally, the president himself, Bush, believes that. If you look at the preemptive war statement in his defense policy of September 2002, which is where it appears for the first time, in that same document, he says what I would have said as a governor about crime here in the state of New York. You can't stop the crime, he says you can't stop the terrorism with just a police force, courts, and prisons. And he says the same thing. We can't do it with just force. And so he gives Colin Powell two programs. One is the partnership program of the Middle East to get together with Arab nations and others that have money and see if you can't spread some of that money to relieve some of the poverty that's creating a provocation, etc. Nice idea. And a second program, the Millennium Program. And then he didn't fund it. And so it's there, he admits you need it, Lincoln would be funding it. Domestically, I'll just settle for this because I want to spend more time with you than to deliver it all by way of a speech. Here are the facts, and you decide what Lincoln would do. Lincoln created an income tax, and he made it progressive. And he said, I'm making it progressive because the people with a lot of money get a lot of money because they're living here in the United States of America. They worked hard, they were lucky, they're brilliant, but also they get it because the country is great. And the Army protects them, and it produces workers, and it helps give them customers. So it's only fair that they should pay more than the poor people and the middle-class struggling people. Everybody should pay what's reasonable for them, but the wealthy people should pay more. Nothing wrong with that, I don't think. And so that's what he believed in. And he did it, and he said it over and over, and he said it as a legislator in Illinois, and he said it as a congressman the one term he had, and he did it as president. They declared it unconstitutional later, and then you had the 16th Amendment to make it constitutional. But that's his position. Today, you have 280, 290 million Americans, 140 million workers. 2% of the population makes $200,000 or more, 2%. That's 2 million of the taxpayers. 2 million of about 110 million taxpayers make $200,000 or more, just 2 million. There were tax cuts. In the first place, the tax cuts occurred because we had a big surplus which Clinton had left us. And that was the reason for the tax cuts. So we're going to give the money back, especially to the rich people who gave it to us because we don't need it. And so there was a big tax cut, 40% of which went to the richest people in the country. And then we lost the surplus, the wars came, more expenses for Iraq, the economy went down, everything went bad, and we gave more tax cuts. And now if you look over the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you'll be giving, some numbers project as much as $1 trillion, even if it was only $500 billion, to the top 2%. What? What? But didn't you say this morning that the deficit's larger than it's ever been? Yes. And the debt is larger than it's ever been? Yes. And Social Security and Medicare in 20 years is going to be in trouble? Yes. And the city of New York had to raise taxes because it got shorted? Yes. And you need more money for Iraq? Yes. And the high schools, the colleges, the tuition is going up when you need skilled workers more than ever, and only 1 out of every 4 American workers is high skilled because they can't get a college education, and you're losing jobs overseas. Didn't you say that? Yes. And you're going to give $1 trillion away in 10 years to the richest people in the country? How dare you? How dare you? That's what Lincoln would say. Only he would say it. He would say it. He would say it in poetry. religion is good too. Religion maybe we ought to talk about. The one thing he would not do is build a policy on a rationale that's purely religious. Because it wouldn't make sense, right? I mean, if you were a Jewish president or a Catholic president or a Buddhist president or a Confucian or whatever, you wouldn't say, well, I have this principle that the other people don't share, the other religions and the religious population, they don't share it. It's mine. Where did you get it? Well, I got it from my church, and, well, where did they get it? Well, who knows? I'm in the church that you get it. If you don't believe it, you get out of the church. I'm in the church, I want to stay, so I believe it. Well, that's the way it works, right? Well, you wouldn't build a policy on that. In order to go to this population, which they're not religious, and you're Jews, and you're this, and you're that, and in order to do that, you have to give an idea, like, I'm against murder. That's what my religion says. And, well, good. We all agree. So you have to have a secular basis to it. What is the principle that allows President Bush to say that Nancy Reagan is wrong and that you can't take embryonic stem cells? The principle is life begins at conception. Life begins at conception is what we Catholics are taught by the church. It's a religious predicate, and a very big one for Catholics. It's the predicate of the abortion position. Life begins at conception, therefore no woman can have an abortion even to save her own life. Well, is that a scientific principle? Dr. John Marburger, who's the bioethicist who works for President Bush, was asked that question. It's in the New York Times about 7 to 8 weeks ago. You can find it, John Marburger. And he said, that is not a scientific issue. That is a, quote, sacred issue. What's a sacred issue? Sacred issue, I guess he meant religious issue. And I think that's why there is trouble now over stem cells. Scientists are saying these are good. President Bush is saying that's life. Well, his bioethicists are saying we can't tell them it's life as scientists. The scientists have never declared it to be life. The Constitution doesn't. The statutes don't. Maybe we should have a great debate in the United States of America and bring everybody in and say, look, forget about your religion. Here's a proposition for you. Should we say that life begins at conception? Nobody wants to deal with this, and I can understand why. I'm particularly sensitive myself because I'm a Catholic, and I know what the implications are. But maybe there should be a dialogue, and we should talk about it. But you can't go from, my religion teaches me it, nobody else or mostly people don't accept that religious proposition, to making a law. He would never do that, Lincoln, in my opinion. He would first have to find a secular rationale for the law. But that's a nice point. It's a position I take in the book. It'll probably draw some heat, but I think it's a reasonable one. I hope you read the book. Please read the book. No, you notice I said, please read the book. I didn't say, please buy the book. If you're really stingy, wait till it gets to the library, but read it eventually. No, I really... because I worked very hard on it. It represents thoughts I've had for a long time. I thought about it for a long time. I think it's all responsible. You may say it's wrong, but I think it can be very useful. I hope you'll read it, and I hope now you'll forgive me the length of this presentation, which is longer than I wanted it to be, and you'll pleasure me with your questions. Thank you very, very much. Okay, who's going to start us?
I have a question. I'm very loud. If you were asked to recommend a candidate for vice president, who would you choose for Harry?
Who would you choose? Who would you choose as a candidate for vice president? That's not a question that's easy for an outsider to answer, because one of the prime ingredients of a good vice president is a person that the president feels very comfortable with. Now, comfortable is something that I can't define, because I don't know whom John Kerry would be comfortable with. And it doesn't follow that a person who you and I agree looks to us like a good political bet. He can get you this state, and the polls say he's very popular, and he gives a good speech like John Edwards, for example. It doesn't follow that the president would be more comfortable with him than somebody else who doesn't have those ingredients. Why? Because it's a matter of confidence. You have to work with the person. You have to be able to take advice from that person. You have to respect that person's experience. John Kerry's been around 35 years or whatever it is. He's been in that Senate for so long. And John Edwards, for example, has only been there for one skimpy term. And there's a question. I think President Bush had difficulty with Dan Quayle, the first President Bush. He was a nice person. I know Dan Quayle. I've debated him a number of times. He's very no. He's not a. He's a very smart guy, but he didn't have the gravitas that President Bush wanted, and so they didn't use him. And I think that has to be considered. I note he's spending time with Gephardt. Now I can see him being comfortable with Gephardt. Why? Gephardt's safe. Gephardt's extremely well educated from his years in the Congress. He's well respected by both sides. He's not deemed highly charismatic, but you don't want a vice president who's highly charismatic. My mother had this wonderful expression, roughly translated from her rough Italian. It was, don't ever, she said it to her daughter Marie, my sister, don't ever think somebody will tell you to wash your face so that you look prettier than they do. Now, that only the old ethnics spoke that way, from bitter experience and an abiding sense of reality. But, you don't necessarily want a dashing vice president who every time you get on a platform makes you look bad by speaking better than you do. So it's a lot of things. He has a lot of really good possibilities. I think there's a larger possibility here, too. I'm very eager to see him come up with a vice president, personally, because I think Kerry plus vice president against Bush and Cheney is better than Kerry against Cheney. Why? Because I think Cheney is eventually going to be a drag on that campaign, because I think he has so many negatives, and they're piling up, and Halliburton's not going to go away. And so I think it would be good to be able to run Kerry and Boop against Bush and Cheney, against Bush and Cheney, against Cheney and Bush. Oh, I'm sorry, Bush and Cheney. So I'd like to see him get somebody. And also what's developing is there are several people who you could announce as potential parts of the group that would be running and the administration of John Kerry, who would be, I think, highly appealing. I think Joe Biden would be appealing to people on the question, Secretary of State. I think Wesley Clark, when you're talking about military and you say Wesley Clark, people say, well, what the heck? Maybe, he wasn't a dazzling candidate, he wasn't used to it, but he's certainly solid as a military person. And you can start naming names like that. And, of course, you have Gephardt, and you have Edwards, and you have Richardson, and all these people would make good, solid choices. So at one point, I think we can expect to see that, a kind of showing off of the potential administration people. Now, you asked me, Vice President, I don't know. I mean, I really don't, because I don't know what Kerry feels here about these people, and that may be the most important thing of all. Can I live with this person? It's one thing to get somebody to win the campaign. Yes, you have to win, but you have to govern, and that's more important. And you have to have somebody who's going to help you be a president who has the ability to do that, and you have to have a comfort level with him that will allow him to express that ability. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Close to home, what we have here in Albany today, and which, of course, you have all that experience, how would we go about reforming this horrible situation where you have a legislature there that simply doesn't work, that if you read the Times today, you're talking about a governor who just took off, about, well, the whole place going on vacation, not even having a budget. How do we go about getting rid of these people who can keep getting elected all the time without doing a damn thing for us?
Well, I can tell, well, I'm surprised, no, I'm not surprised that there is just a smattering of applause, because I think nobody knows what's happening in Albany. I really do. No, Albany's another world for especially people from New York City. And I didn't realize it until I went up there and spent 12 years. My first job was in Albany as a law clerk in the Court of Appeals as a young pisher. But in Albany, I said that nobody would even know I was talking about. But let me tell you what I have been saying about this since 1977. I went into public life in 1975. And I said, in 1977, you must repair the system in Albany. People in Albany get reelected 98, 99% of the time. Why? Because they have a staff, they send newsletters to their assembly district or their Senate district saying all the good things about them. Nobody competes with them. Nobody wants to spend a lot of money to win an assembly seat. You know, what is Congress? You want me to spend $1 million to be an assembly person? So they don't spend a lot of money. And so this keeps them assured of incumbency. And once they're assured of incumbency, why should they change any of the rules? And so they don't. I said, this is only going to get worse. And it got worse in my 12 years. And those late budgets that I got punished for in 1994 are later now than ever. And the system is more dysfunctional now than it was in 1977. And I said the same thing every year. And I called the New York Times and asked them about it. You must have a constitutional convention. You must gather up a constitutional convention and sit back and say, listen, we're going to start from scratch. We're going to take the Constitution of the state and we're going to change it. And we're going to change it so that you can't be guaranteed 99% turnover. We're going to give people on the outside a better opportunity to know what you're doing up there and to challenge you. However, we have to do that. We have to effect a campaign finance reform that brings the system closer to New York City's campaign finance, which is a much fairer, much more intelligent system than the state uses. You have to do a lot of things. Now, every time I said that, see, here's the way it works constitutionally, and the very complexity of it operates against it, and it's one of the reasons it hasn't happened. Every 20 years, the Constitutional Convention proposition appears on your ballot. So it was on the ballot in 77. It was on the ballot again in 1997. In 1997, myself and Jerry Benjamin, who's a Republican from upstate, who's written books, who's very smart, who teaches in New Paltz, and he's very Republican, very much different from my own politics, but we're good friends. We both worked hard, but we had no money. And the legislature worked against us, and the unions worked against us because they were working with the legislature, and they defeated the proposition in 77, and they defeated the proposition in 97. Now, finally, last week, Quinnipiac took a poll. And Quinnipiac said to the people of New York and everywhere, do you think we should have a constitutional convention? And the vote was 54-31, yes, let's have a constitutional convention. And what I'm hoping now, and I've spoken to some people, is that let's get serious. If nothing else, let's make it such a real threat to this legislature that they will do something. And if they don't, let's have a constitutional convention and change the whole darn system. And that's the only answer. Nothing is going to happen. Look, it hasn't happened since 1977. What makes you think it's going to happen now unless you do something dramatic? And that's Constitutional Convention. Yes, sir.
You used the word dialogue, which is a word I studied with Hannah Arendt, and she used to say democracy is dialogue. And I feel for the first time in my life that there is less dialogue in America on every level, whether it's the press, whether it's Congress. Certainly what you talked about, the 28-second ads in the campaign, there's no dialogue. And even when the presidential candidates go to speak, they're such pats, they're using the same language because they're afraid to say anything that will not get them elected, rather than say, I hope the things that are in their hearts. So I'm just wondering, is there a way to go back and find dialogue in this country? And isn't it necessary to have a democracy?
Well, there are a couple of things you can do, and we can do something with this film, and then let me come back to that. But there are a couple of things you could do. You see, I talked about the inability to change the situation in Albany because of the structure of the law and the Constitution of the state, et cetera. The same thing happens in Washington. We now have a campaign finance system that is just out of control. You can't correct it. Feingold and McCain put together a bill, and everybody was hopeful it would do something. Both the Democrats and the Republicans found ways around it. And so now there's all kinds of soft money. You got nothing done. Well, is there any answer? Well, it's hard to do because Buckley against Valeo, which is a Supreme Court precedent, says that a rich person who has great individual wealth, you can't stop them from spending their own wealth. And therefore, if you do construct a system, all you need is a rich person who has his or her own wealth, which in this country we have now more billionaires, well, we're just short of our first trillionaire, I guess. I guess Gates missed it by a little bit, but no, I don't think he got to $1 trillion. But we have more and more billionaires and more millionaires. Millionaires are commonplace now. Still only 2% over 200,000, but a whole lot of billionaires. And you put a few of those together, and they own the system. So what can you do? Well, you can do this. We do have a lot of money in the federal system that comes from taxpayers. The taxpayers put money and they give it to the presidential candidates. You could, if the Congress wanted to, they could at least do this. Look, we're going to give you the money, but we're going to demand that it gets spent in a way that produces a better dialogue. And so we're going to give you the money, but you can't have any 28-second commercials. Why? They're too short. You can have a 5-minute commercial, because in 5 minutes, if you don't say anything, you're really going to look pretty ridiculous. 28 seconds, you can get away with it. Show a few pictures, it's over. So that's one thing. You have to have 15 debates. You have to have a debate every week, and it has to be a certain kind of debate. You see, here are the debates now. And debates are better than the non-debates, but here are the debates now. If you have 4 candidates or 3 candidates or even 2 candidates, the debates are, I'll give you a minute to answer this question, I'll give you 30 seconds to answer, okay? You have 13 debates, you ask the terrorism question 13 times, you get the same 1 minute and the same 30 seconds. And it never gets any deeper. And so we should structure it so that, look, here's the kind of inquisition we're going to have. We're going to have the candidates, we're going to have good inquisitors, or smart people who will question you. And you can bring Cheney, and you can bring your assistant, and you can bring your books if you want in the beginning of the campaign. But we're going to ask you every big question. Terrorism, the intelligence, what did you do, what didn't you do? And we're going to let you answer those questions and put them all on record. Right in the beginning of the campaign. We're going to keep, now, we're not going to print it all, but we're going to keep it on record, and every reporter will know. You can spend a whole day on the economy. I did this with the New York Times in 1994, just to try it. I said, let me come in. You can have all the time you want to ask me any question on the economy. I will answer it. I'll bring people with me. If I need them to help me, that's the way you govern. You don't do it by yourself. A debate shouldn't be a test of glibness. God forbid what you get is a glib president. Should we drop the bomb? Well, let me tell you, of course we should. You should ask people, you should study, you should think. So there are ways by conditioning the use of campaign finance, you can force them to have a more intelligent campaign. And that's something that the Congress will have to do, but if the people figure that idea out, they can put the pressure on the Congress to get it done. Now, let me talk to you again about this film. It's true that I was retained as a lawyer. It's true that tomorrow we have an appeal which by some strange accident. They have said I can't appear in Los Angeles personally, notwithstanding I was negotiating with them for 3 days to go from an R rating to a PG-13 for a lot of complicated reasons, because the audience is larger with a PG-13 than an R. Although most people don't really know what an R is, and most people don't really know what a PG-13 is, the net effect is that R costs you 10 to 20% of the audience. So anyway, I was negotiating, trying to get it done. Our artist, Michael Moore, and the producers didn't want to give up what they wanted us to give up because they thought too much of the truth went. Some graphic images that they wanted to leave in the film. And so I have written my argument, which got published today in San Diego. It's only 5 pages, and it'll be delivered for me at the appeal tomorrow. We don't know how we're going to do. They tell us, well, it's not hopeful. You'll probably get stuck with an R. And if that's the case, that's the case. But here's the opportunity this film gives us, and here's why I took it. It's not because I'm a Democrat and this is good for the Democrats, which it probably is. But this can be good for the process. Why? I saw the film before I agreed to represent the producer. I saw it 3 times. I saw it myself. I saw it with Matilda. I saw it with Matilda and my daughter Maria and her husband Ken and their kids, 3 kids. And we watched it, and I watched the whole thing. And so I'm absolutely convinced that the other side will be upset and will say, well, the insinuation there is not fair and this is not fair. Fine. That's wonderful. Step forward and let's conduct the debate and the dialogue using that documentary. And why don't you do a documentary? Just go out and do a documentary. You can do it. We talked about, not we, but the film talks about Prince Bandar, the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, 2 days after 9/11, sitting with the President of the United States for dinner privately for 3 hours. Great. What did you talk about? The people who were involved, the terrorists, were Saudi Arabians. Did you talk about that? The madrasas are being fed with Saudi Arabian money. The madrasas are teaching young Muslims to kill the infidels. We are the infidels. And everybody knows that maybe billions of dollars have gone into those schools. Did you talk about that? You say we implied terrible things. We said nothing. We said you sat down and had dinner 2 days after 9/11, where you got 3 hours to have dinner with the Prime Minister quietly in that madness. How you were able to find 3 hours, I don't know, but you did. And we want the American people to know it. And because the American people are going to say to you, Mr. President, please explain that. So step forward and explain it. If you can explain it, score 1 for you. And so on and so forth. The film gives us an opportunity to have a much better campaign than you could have without it, because it is not a speech. It is not an unchallenged address given to a captive audience. All Republicans here, all Democrats there. I give a speech which, says only my side of the case. They all cheer. That's on the television that night for 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds. And then maybe you have 2 or 3 debates. And you know what the debates are going to be. The president will keep them down to the minimum length. And since the answer will only be a minute and a half, how much trouble can he get in? I mean, as a matter of fact, if you talk very slowly, you can get away without saying anything. And so that's what I want you to keep your eye on with this film. Just don't let them say, well, it's a lot of baloney. Michael Moore lied when he was in grammar school. I don't like the way he dresses. He's too heavy. Forget all of that. That is called ad hominem. That is to distract you from the film. What you should say, and I'm not saying you should all believe every implication in the film. Just use it to give us a better debate than we're having now. Because you're right. The debate now is awful. It's awful. And it just does not get to the heart of the matter. And everybody knows it.
To hear your opinion about Congress and why they're not stepping up more at this time when we have a weak president, and what they can do and they didn't do to get us into this situation we're in, and how they can help to get
Well,
us out.
all right, well, let's, Congress, personally, first of all, Congress has the right to declare war and to insist on it. Congress has the right to say, Mr. President, don't do a thing on this. Don't pull a trigger on this until you come to us and we take a look at it and declare war. Congress hasn't done that, I guess, since the Second World War. Why? Because they don't want to. They passed a War Powers Act that every president has ignored. Every president said, no, it's unconstitutional. And nobody ever went to court. Why? They don't want to. Congress doesn't want to face the responsibility a Congress should have. It's as simple as that. And you can get into trouble that way, and we got into trouble. The Democrats got into trouble. How? Well, you know, some of them voted for the resolution. So let's face it. Look at the Constitution. It says who declares war? The Congress does. Did they declare war here? Did they declare it in Vietnam? Where did they declare it? When's the last time? So Congress is taking a pass. Now, as to asserting power in the Congress, I hope they don't, because the Republicans are in charge of both houses. And they're the ones with the power. The most the Democrats can do is every once in a while get lucky with a clever device and slow you down or force you, to just stymie the situation because you can't get enough votes to override their stymie action. But that's all negative. The sadness of Nancy Pelosi's position and the position in the Senate with Tom Daschle is that these are wonderfully bright people with good ideas who want to do good things, but they have no efficacy to speak of because the system allows the majority to block everything. The minority can't block everything, but the majority can, and that's what's happening. And so, well, what do you do about that? Well, if you get a president, that will help a little bit, maybe even a lot, because the president has a lot of power too. Most of all, he has the bully pulpit. And the bully pulpit is the greatest power you can have. And that's how Lincoln won everything that he wanted. It was from the podium, by standing up and debating Douglas in the first place over and over on slavery, and coming from oblivion as a politician in a world where there was no television, and you had to read the debates, and word of mouth had to travel around the country to the extent that it could. He achieved enough popularity by coming to New York to Cooper Union and giving a great address in Cooper Union where he had never been here. It was an alien world to him. And he got up to that podium and delivered a masterpiece of analysis and poetry and history. It was marvelous. And that's the way he won, through the power of that bully pulpit. So if Kerry were to win, even if you don't win one house, it'd be nice if you could win one house. It'd be glorious if you could win two. Well, some people would say that's too much. If you had the president and both houses, then you got a Bush situation. It's a Republican president and both houses, and that means Supreme Court. God forbid what these people will do to the Supreme Court if you give him 4 more years, because there's going to be a lot of empty seats over the next 4 years. And if you have, and this is in the book too, Lincoln and President Bush and President Roosevelt and most presidents have this tendency in common. They want people that they are politically compatible with, not just the best judge, because the best, theoretically, in picking a justice for the Supreme Court, you shouldn't know anything about their politics. I'm not going to ask you about, theoretically, I'm not going to ask you about Roe against Wade. I'm not going to ask you to tell me that you'll vote this way or that way, because every case has to be decided anew. Roe against Wade was decided in 1973. It says that viability is at 24 weeks. What does that mean? It means that at 24 weeks, the fetus can live outside the womb. And that was critical, because at that point, they said the woman's right to abort becomes much, much, much less. Only to save her own life or health can she abort at that stage. That's a big deal. If you were to try Roe against Wade now, what do you think science would say about the period of viability? I suspect, I'm not a scientist, but just from what I read, I suspect that it wouldn't be 24 weeks, it'd be a lot less. That they would conclude that because of various changes in treatment, et cetera, it's possible for the fetus to survive outside the womb at an earlier stage, in which case that reduces the number of abortions that are possible. So you have all of this going on. What more can I say? Well, I can say a lot more, but I better not. Yeah. Yes.
Do you know of anyone who you think you would like to see governor of New York after Pataki is out?
Excuse me, anyone I'd like to see as governor of New York?
Yes.
I can think of two people in this order: me and my son. Actually, let me make that my son and I. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I want to say I admire your courage because you stand up and you tell us as it is, Fahrenheit 9/11 being such a controversial subject. And I wish the Democratic Party and their representatives would exhibit the same courage. You say you know Kerry. I don't know Kerry. He voted for it before he voted against it. And for 35 years, his record, I don't know the man. Now, as far as I am a Democrat, but I'm getting very disappointed. For instance, Daschle, our speaker, voted with the Republicans for the late-term abortion. And that, to me, was a tremendous disappointment and a weakness. I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, I think that, that's going to be decided by the Supreme Court. The argument on the late-term abortion is really a Roe against Wade argument. If, in fact, the Roe against Wade decision was, and this the constitutional law at this moment is Roe against Wade. It's not a statute, it's Roe against Wade, that decision. If the constitutional law of Roe against Wade is, as I believe it is, that in that last trimester, it doesn't talk about the method of abortion, it talks about whether you can or you can't have an abortion. You can not have an abortion unless the woman shows that it is a serious matter of health or even her life. Life more obvious than health. And so to say now, even if it's going to endanger you, you can't do it that way, would be a contradiction of Roe against Wade. And so you're facing an unconstitutional bill. And that's what the courts have said so far. They've said, look, whatever you think about this process, Roe against Wade says that, that's the law. This is a land of law. If you want to change it, you have to do one of two things. You have to get lucky, those of you who want to change, and get a judge or judges who will see the case differently and who next time they get Roe against Wade will alter it in a way that bans these abortions. So one way to change the law is by getting judges to do it. The other way is a constitutional amendment. Okay? Now, for the absolutists on the issue of abortion, for the fundamentalists on the issue of abortion, who deride all those who don't agree with them and say, you're wrong for not standing up for the absolute law. I don't know anybody who has stood up for the absolute law. The absolute law, fundamentally, is no abortions except to save the life of the mother. Why don't you ask for a constitutional amendment to do that if you really believe in that? If all you Republicans will put it into your campaign every year, every presidential year, it's in there in the campaign, it's up there, and this is our platform, we believe life begins at conception, then you should ask for a constitutional amendment because the court hasn't done it for you. Why don't you step forward and say to the United States of America, okay, you women, even if you have to die, you can't have an abortion. Why don't you say that? Because they'll reject it, that's why. Well then, say to me, rather than, I'm an absolutist and anything less is hypocrisy, say, I'm not really an absolutist. What I'm really saying is there are too many abortions, and we have to find a way to limit the number, because the absolute position is life begins at conception. That's the Roman Catholic teaching. And the answer to that has to be a constitutional amendment that says no abortion at any stage, not a minute after conception. Nobody's ever asked for that. Not Reagan, not Bush 1, not Bush 2, no Republicans, nobody campaigns on it, nobody. Have you ever heard anybody campaign on it? And nobody will. Nobody will. So, what else can I say on that?
Court, we wouldn't have to worry so much.
Say what?
I think you should have been on the Supreme Court. We wouldn't need to worry so
Well,
much now.
Let me tell you about the Supreme Court. And let me get all the way back to the point about Lincoln and the difference between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and the difference between the Constitution and what the country really needs. The Constitution gives us freedom and liberty. Thank God we have that. But we need much more. We need a society that understands interconnectedness and interdependence, a society that knows we should have health care for everybody who needs it. Everybody who needs it. A society that understands that you shouldn't spend $2 trillion in $1 trillion on me and my clients when you've got people who are truly suffering in this society. You know, to say that Medicaid takes care of the elderly ill is a joke. It's a joke. Medicare doesn't do what the elderly need. You know what the problem is with drugs, and that hasn't been solved, prescription drugs. We have so many needs. Only 1 out of 4 workers in this country is high-skilled. Only 1 out of 4. That means only 1 out of 4 have gotten 4 years beyond high school. We, some years ago, gave 200,000 visas for people to be computer engineers. And they started here from overseas. They came here and got $80,000. Our average wage was $38,000. And we were giving them $80,000 because we didn't educate our own people to do that work. How does that make any sense? Now, none of that can you solve by sitting in a robe. And look, I've said over and over, personally, Supreme Court, wow, what a job. No fundraising. Nothing. Dental care until you're 100, you know. You don't even have to wear pants. You could come to work in sneakers and shorts. Nobody would know. You got a robe on. You know, it's wonderful. But you couldn't do what I'm doing at this moment. You couldn't do what I'm doing with them now. Maybe nobody listens. What do I get? Maybe everybody disagrees. You went there and you lost everybody. Maybe so. But at least I tried. At least I made my case. At least I used Lincoln. At least I pleaded with people to go see the film. At least I said, just think about it a little bit more. Wouldn't it be better if instead of putting that money there, we took that $1 trillion back, put some into education, some into health care, some into tax cuts for the local governments where they have such problems? Wouldn't that be better? If I just left a little idea in your head, I wouldn't be allowed to do that as a Supreme Court justice. I couldn't get up here and make a political speech. It's a sin, and a civic sin if you did it. So you know, the notion that, well, if you were there, you get 3 or 4 cases a year, maybe they're very, very important. This way I can argue every day of my life on things that are really very, very important to the American people. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
I have to tell you that I do agree with that decision that you made years ago. I agreed at the time that when you turned it down for these reasons.
Thank
we
you.
need your voice. I said that against
Thank you.
all
Would
the
you
other
talk to
people.
Matilda?
Well, I know that your advisors and your family didn't agree
Thank
with
you.
you, but I did for this very reason. Your voice is precious, and it would be silenced
Thank
really
you.
virtually.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about was I'm concerned with Kerry and his ability to pull it off, because I just am. I mean, you know, and I'm not, like, I wanted to know, had you considered, because I agreed with and I can only speculate why you didn't run, when everybody was asking you to run, and was it 92, whatever. I can only speculate, and I thought he couldn't win because he's too true to his principles, and the climate was very different. Like the way you couldn't win because of death penalty in the state, whatever. You're not going to change just to get elected. So I don't know what your reasons were, but I wanted to know, had you considered running this time, and if not, why not?
No.
And I think we need you now more than ever,
Let me-
because nobody speaks
No,
the
no.
way you do.
No, I
know
didn't.
it's-
Very quickly. No, I didn't consider it this time. But I do want to talk about Kerry. And if you heard this story, stop me. But my
No, I have them.
death penalty and my mother. 1977. I'm running against Ed Koch. Son of Sam is running around. You remember that summer? What a summer. We're running for mayor, and she comes in. She says, "May you know won the electric chair?" I said, "No." She said, "May Katya won the electric chair?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "I know. A woman who came to the store and says, 'How come your son is so big, is so strong, he's so stupid and is so weak?'" I said, "Whoa." And she says, "You got to have the electric chair. You got to kill them. And they're animals, some of these people." I said, "Mine." And I gave her all the arguments why, it's wrong, it's bad. And she says, "That's all. Then are you going to lose?" I said, "So I'll lose. You want me to change my mind? I'm your baby. You want me to change my mind just to win the election?" And she says, "No, you don't have to change. Here's what you do. You tell them you won the electric chair. After you win, give the so, number one. John Kerry, I believe very sincerely, has everything you need to win, and I believe he will win. Now, see, right now, it is, as I pointed out, for very good reasons, because the focus is where it should be, on terrorism, etc., and some people are thinking about the economy, but not clearly yet. And they're not paying attention to Kerry so much, they're paying attention to President Bush. And so it's Bush against Bush, and Bush is losing. He's losing points in the standings. And under those circumstances, if you were Kerry, why should you step in front of him? You have two problems if you do that. You may distract from whatever the forces are that are driving Bush down in the polls, and you might be blamed for stepping in front of your commander-in-chief in the middle of a very difficult time, and that's not good for the country. So he's got that against him. But before this is over, as I said before, the people are going to turn the camera and say, "Okay, now, John, it's your turn." And that's when he has to make his stand and show that he's different. And that's when he does have to take the president on and say some different things. And there are 2-3 things. I did this on Jon Stewart's show one night. They said, "Well, what do you think Kerry can say?" And I said, he can say a lot. If, for example, he would have the opportunity and he looked at the American people and said, "Look, you don't really know me well. Let me tell you about myself very, very briefly. I love this country for the same reason you do. It's been very good to me and my family. And in my case, it's probably been better to my family than it was to yours. And I love it so much that when Vietnam came, I volunteered, along with other people, to risk my life for my country. And I did, and I got medals. I'm not sure I deserved them, but I got them, and I was grateful. But I did something more, and so did others, something much, much more than volunteer to risk my life. I volunteered to kill for my country. And I did, more than once. And I came back with such a detestation when it occurred to me that maybe I did that in a war that was not necessary, and that was wrong. And I pledged to myself then that for the rest of my life I would do everything I possibly could to be sure that I did not allow us to go to war unless it was clear beyond a reasonable doubt that we needed to. That's why I'm so sad about Iraq. Yes, I voted for it. I expected the president to do more diplomacy, and he didn't, and that disappointed me. But I voted for it, and so did other people, and we were fooled. We were fooled by poor intelligence. We were fooled. I don't think the president lied. I think he was fooled too. And I'll tell you, if I am president, I'll never, never, never allow that to happen again. But it was a mistake. And as to where we are in Iraq, it's good that we got rid of Saddam. I doubt we can make these people a democracy in a hurry. I'll get our forces back as soon as possible, but not until I'm sure that there will not be chaos there, because then we'll only have to go back. But I will tell you this, you cannot win the war against terrorism unless you do a lot more than just catch and kill and imprison terrorists, which I'll promise to do. We have to do more with respect to the madrasas, spell it out. We have to do more with respect to the economy, as the president himself admitted but didn't do. Spell that out, the two Powell programs. And as to the economy, I simply want to say this to the American people. Don't be fooled by financial pages of the best newspapers and economists telling you the economy is good. It is good. By all the economic measures, it's very good. But that's not the test. The test for the American people is it good for you? The economy is very, very good for me and my clients. The economy is good for what David Brooks called in the Times this week the aristocracy of money. He said he's a conservative. There are two aristocracies up at the top. The aristocracy of ideas, the people who want evidence, ideas, intelligence, and the aristocracy for money, those people who manage organizations that produce products for profit. And he put President Bush in the aristocracy of money. And he said the aristocracy of ideas is offended that he doesn't read newspapers. Yeah. I am offended he doesn't read newspapers. Because if you don't read newspapers, you probably don't read books either. And if you don't read books, I don't know, and you're not watching my documentary, I don't know where you're getting your facts. So there is plenty he can say. He has the record. He has Israel. His record on Israel is perfect. He's got 100% AIPAC record on Israel. It's clear to everybody that one of the things you have to do to deal with terrorism is to make sure you make peace in Israel. I don't think we really tried. President Bush is very popular with the Jewish community. I'm surprised. I'm surprised how popular. No, I think I understand it. He was popular because he was very clever. In the beginning, if you go all the way back to his campaign, he made no moves toward Israel. He was diffident toward Israel. He didn't want to play any role. And then he came up with a plan. And the plan was, if you get rid of Arafat and you get rid of the terrorists, then you come back to me and I'll help you with my plan. Come back in 3 years. That was after this election. And everybody said, that's great. He's saying all the things that Sharon and the Israelis wanted to hear. But when he said 3 years after the election, I said, wait a minute. Sure, it's nice. But say a year. Say something else. Let's get in the game here. Let's help Israel. Don't step back and say, get rid of Arafat and get rid of terrorism. How are they going to do it without you? How are you going to put the pressure on them without the United States of America? So he's got a perfect record on Israel. He can do plenty on the issue of Israel. And that's important way beyond the Jewish community. It's important because it's being used as a provocation and an excuse for terrorism. So we have to help Israel make peace. And how do you do that? By putting pressure on Israel? No, God forbid. I'm not even an even-handedness guy. I mean, when people say, you should be even-handed, well, I don't know exactly what you mean by that. We helped create Israel. Israel is our ally because they're the only democracy like us. They're the only value system exactly like us in that part of the world that really counts. They've been there for us as long as we've been there for them. And I think we have a special obligation to them. As a matter of fact, you can't have peace unless we serve as guarantor of their security. Because once they make a deal with them, how do you know they won't turn around at some point, Israel's enemies, and say, we didn't really mean it? You have to be there, the United States of America, as guarantor of performance for Israel in that deal. And I think Kerry will probably say something like that at the right time. So I think there's plenty he can do. He has the skill. He has the mind. He has one problem. No. The problem is this. He is subtle. The problem is he is nuanced. The problem is he is intelligent. And that is his problem. You know, this is a complicated thing to operate on. Very complicated to operate on. It takes fine instruments. And that's what Kerry is using. The other guy is using a wedge, the simplest tool known to mankind, you know, and everybody understands it. And he speaks that way, and everybody says, "That's the well, drop a bomb on their head. This is a tough guy," you know. Last question.
After all is said and done, doesn't the war really come down to one thing? Oil. I mean, Bush is an oil man. His father was an oil man. There's a corporate oil conglomerate to his left and to his right. I mean, he's not looking to bring the democracy to the Mideast. He wants to control the Mideast so we can control the oil supply.
Maybe in the beginning that was somebody's aspiration. I think it certainly is the history of this country, and particularly if you see the Fahrenheit 9/11, you will see a heavy emphasis on the Carlyle Corporation. It has baffled me from the beginning why that wasn't a whole series in every newspaper in the United States. What is the Carlyle Corporation? How come James Baker and George Bush, after they finished, went and did business with all these people in the Carlyle Corporation? What are all these relationships of billions of dollars being made by Americans? Why are you so cozy with it? I mean, there's plenty of reason to want to know more about that situation. And maybe in the beginning, the fact that there was oil there, and we're very good at that as a country, let's face it. We have gone all over the world to where the resources were and plucked and picked the fruit off the trees and left them behind barren. We've done that. In other places we've developed and we've done good things, but we're capable of that. I don't see the evidence now. And whatever they thought of in the beginning, even if that was on their mind, we're going to grab hold of the oil, they've lost the chance to get away with it at this point. It's not going to happen. The United Nations is not going to let it happen. The rest of the world's not going to let it happen. And Halliburton's not going to get away with anything. And incidentally, as long as we can keep Cheney on the ticket with Bush, you know, it's a nice thing to have floating out there in the atmosphere. But I can't candidly say I see oil as a motivation at this point. I mean, whatever aspiration they might have had in the beginning, it just didn't work out where they could wind up with the oil. All right, last question? Okay.
I could just bring the subject back to the book. When you first addressed us, you said what motivated you, inspired you to write the book was the first anniversary of 9/11.
Right.
And frankly, I was disappointed in our politicians that they went to Lincoln. And I was wondering, because I think if Lincoln were alive today, he would have found the words himself. So I was wondering if in the book you address what Lincoln might have said on that day.
Not directly, but yes. I think if you go to page 166, Lincoln speaks in the book. There's a whole speech by Lincoln, and it does deal with 9/11, and it does deal with his feelings on 9/11. And let me just, on the subject of speaking, let's be very candid about this. One of the people in the audience made a very intelligent point, and that is, it's not always easy to say the truth as you see it. I remember the day after 9/11. I guess it was the day after 9/11. Diane Sawyer, I'm not sure now, it was such a terrible mess for all of us and so confusing. And we had an office there in 1993, the first time it blew up. We had an office on the 57th floor because I was governor at that time. And, you know, you go back to all those recollections. And Diane Sawyer asked me about, aren't there a lot of questions that come out of this, Governor? You were there, and you spoke to the Secret Service and the CIA, and the Secret Service had an office in the building. and the CIA and all these people, and don't you have questions? I said, I sure do. You know, why we didn't do more, what happened to the intelligence system, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, and there were other questions. And maybe one of the biggest ones is, you know, why, what would possess these people? What is it that drives them to hate us so much that they would surrender their own life to take ours? What is that? Is that mad zealotry? I mean, and if so, you know, what fuels that hate? And I said, look, we're obviously going to find out who did it, and we will go after them with a vengeance, and we will tear them to bits one way or another. We'll bring our armed forces. That's true. But I hope that in the process, we don't forget that we need to find the source of this. What's creating this crime? What's creating this hate? And Diane said something like, well, I think that's very intelligent. And I got killed. I got phone calls, notes, you mushy-headed root causes. How dare you suggest that we're wrong? I didn't suggest we're wrong. I said we have to, and incidentally, it's still true. That's what the madrasas are all about. You look for an explanation and you find it. You find it in the schools. The schools are teaching children to hate. That's one reason. You find it in the streets of the Middle East that used to be the most powerful place in the world for a considerable period of time, that lived through the Crusades in which we were barbarous, the infidels, and Christians ate Muslim babies alive in some of the Crusades. You know, you look for those things. You say, well, what do we do about that? How do we help? You've got to do that. But when you say it, there are a lot of people out there and say, I see, he's not. If you just say, well, I promise you we will get them, we will chase them, we will fire them, we will fry them, we will hang them, we won't give them a trial, we'll have the Patriot Act, and then you get a considerable number of people say, that's exactly what I want. And that's a big problem. Subtlety is a problem. And sometimes telling the whole truth is a problem. Death penalty is only a small example. Death penalty is only a small example. But I lived through 20 or 30 years of polls that said 80, 20, 75, 25. You kept saying, look, you're killing innocent people and it's not doing any good and you're not making things better. And now you have DNA and it's obvious that you have been killing innocent people all along and it doesn't do any good. And still, there's a reluctance for people to face that. Why? Because you're taking vengeance away from them. And to some people, that's all they have. They're so frustrated, God forbid, you lose somebody, somebody gets killed, somebody by some butcher, some madman. And for some people, that's all they have, is that, you know, that feeling of, well, at least I got even. And that's a very powerful thing. And that's what the country felt after 9/11, and still does feel to a large extent. And it's perfectly human. But here, they asked me, the question they asked Mike Dukakis about the death penalty. He said, what would happen if somebody touched one of your children or Matilda or something? I said, I would kill them. I'm sure I would kill them. I'd go crazy. I'd probably grab them and strangle them. But you can't make laws that accommodate your worst moment as a human being. You have to be able to understand that's a wrong reaction, no matter how human it is. And the human reaction to 9/11, human reaction to the death penalty is not us at our best. And what you need is us at our best. Thank you very, very much. God bless you.